Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. In preparation for a talk at a church coming up, I've been reading a lot about skeptics and atheists and their arguments online and through other literature, and I've come across all kinds of interesting things. One of the things I came across not too long ago was a blog post that is, well, now it's, in fact, it's almost exactly 2 years old, by a former pastor, and it's on Patheos.com. Patheos is a real well-known blog spot. Patheos, Patheos.com. And the name of the blog is called 8 Things Your Pastor Will Never Tell You About the Bible. That's exactly how Bible. Anyway, this guy is a guest post written by Richard Hagenston. It says, Hagenston is an ordained United Methodist minister, a former pastor, and the author of Fabricating Faith, How Christianity Became a Religion Jesus Would Have Rejected. Boom. He drops the mic. Boom. Anyway, I thought the title was pretty cool. 8 Things Your Pastor Will Never Tell You About the Bible. And so this former pastor wants to tell us what no one will ever tell you. Well, I'm a pastor, and I will tell you about these things. So that's unfortunate. No, I get the flair. You know, you it makes you want to read it. They'll never tell you. Well, the first thing my thought is about the Bible. I was expecting to read things about the Bible, not things in the Bible, but things about the Bible. So about the Bible would be how the Bible is formed, about the canon, or codex, or the manuscript tradition, things like that, or and so forth. But that's not at all what the blog is about. What he meant to say was 8 things your pastor will never tell you about things that occur within the Bible, or things you might not have noticed. Well, because of that, these are, I think, really quite silly. If you read the Bible carefully, you don't need a pastor to tell you these things. You don't at all need a pastor. You just need to read your Bible. And I want to say just a few things here and make this a 2-part podcast. Here's what he says at the beginning, quote, when I was a United Methodist pastor, I learned an unsettling thing from my own experiences and those of some colleagues serving other churches. Many ministers keep secrets about the Bible, lest things they learned in seminary or otherwise know hurt church attendance and the Sunday offering. This put some friends of mine in a terrible quandary, forced to say things from the pulpit that were doctrinally demanding, but which they had come to privately question. As for me, I resolved the matter by leaving the pastorate. When I did, I got calls of congratulations from 2 nearby ministers. One of those calls was especially poignant. He said I was fortunate to have other skills from my previous work experience that I could draw on, but he added that all he had been trained to do was to be a minister, and that he felt trapped in the pulpit saying things he no longer believed in order to continue supporting his family. It's time our secrets about the Bible came out. It's time for Christians to know what their pastors won't tell them. End quote. Dun, 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 dun. Well, first off, I'm very, very sad about the fact that he left. I'm really mean that. I'm being silly, but I'm sad that he left the faith because of that. That must have been very, very difficult. He doesn't say that. I just would imagine it'd be very difficult. And secondly, I'm sorry that he had a pastor friend say that if he had other training, he would leave because he doesn't believe in anything he's preaching. That's profoundly hypocritical. But that's also sad. But I also understand what he's saying, that some people won't talk about their doubts or things they're concerned about from the pulpit. I think that's true. I think some people probably do have, as he says, they privately question. Well, I've met pastors, many good, faithful pastors who have private questions we've talked about, but for them it just doesn't matter that much. So they question it, but they don't have to have all the answers to keep having the faith they do have. Now later on, this pastor says he still has faith, he still is a Christian. It's just apparently a radically different form than what he had before. And let me tell you, I'm going to go through some of this. Well, I'll go through all of his responses, what he says that your pastor will never tell you. And it's time for Christians to figure this out. So here we go. I can't wait to hear what it is, what Christians have never been told before until this man. Number 1, the apostles of Jesus seem to have known nothing about a virgin birth. He says, the earliest mention of the birth of Jesus to be written is not the nativity stories in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but verses in Paul's letter to the Romans. He wrote it after having met with Peter and others who had known in person not only Jesus, but also his mother and brothers. Despite learning from them everything they could tell him about Jesus, Paul shows no sign of having heard of a virgin birth. Instead, he wrote that Jesus, quote, was descended from David according to the flesh, end quote, and was declared to be the Son of God, not through any special birth that God mentions, but by his resurrection. That's in Romans 1, 3-4. The nativity stories in Matthew and Luke, suggesting that Jesus had a virgin birth in Bethlehem, the birthplace of David, were composed later, and even his own apostles show no indication of knowing anything about it. End quote. Okay, my response to that is, again, there's no secret. Anybody who reads the Bible realizes that this is exactly the case. So I was real surprised, because this one, most of these seem really silly to me. This has seemed one of them. So they do not seem to know about the virgin birth, because they don't talk about it unless you include the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So what he's done is to say he's making a lot of assumptions that you just have to assume, but they're not demonstrated by the text. There's no evidence for what he's saying. For example, when this guy says that, quote, that Paul, after having met with Peter and others who had known in person not only Jesus but his mother and brothers, he says, despite learning from them everything they could tell him about Jesus, Paul shows no sign of having heard of a virgin birth. End quote. He gets this, I know what he's referring to. That's, everybody knows this in scholarship, in Galatians 1. Okay, in Galatians 1, Paul says that his message about the resurrection of Jesus doesn't come just because someone handing it down. It's because he, in fact, saw the risen Jesus. He saw it. And he is very adamant about that point. He says, after I saw him, then I ran off to Arabia to make sure that, let me just read the verse. Galatians 1:12. For I did not receive it or learn it from any human source. Instead, I received it by a revelation of Jesus Christ. A revelation of Jesus Christ. That's not a voice. Revelation means a vision. He encountered him. And then he says, I didn't go and meet people right away. I went off into Arabia. In verse 18, that's in verse 17. Verse 18, he says, then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, that's Peter, and get information from him, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I didn't see anybody else except James, the Lord's brother. Now, this reference demonstrates Paul went to see Peter and he saw James. Now, that's all we have. So when this author of the blog says he went, despite learning from them everything they could tell him about Jesus, my response is, what evidence do you have from that? We simply have no idea what Paul talked about with Peter and James. We have no idea. Now, most New Testament interpreters, and I'm one of them, thinks that what he learned from them in the first few years of his conversion, after 3 years, are traditions about Jesus and his teaching. But to say he learned everything they could in 15 days, I mean, that seems silly to me. Anyway, you don't know that. He's assuming it, that's fine, but it's an assumption, and nothing in the text tells me he learned everything about that. Secondly, when he says Paul shows no sign of having heard of a virgin birth, my response is, so what? I mean, really, so what? Just because in Romans 1, when he's descended from David according to the flesh, that in no way contradicts the biblical text. In Matthew, that's exactly the case. He comes from Joseph, from the line of David. So this is exactly, even though in Matthew, he's adopted by Joseph. So I don't find this argument from silence compelling at all, that Paul did not know of a virgin birth, because Paul doesn't say it. There's a whole host of things Paul doesn't talk about Jesus, but surely he knew more about Jesus than the few references to the Corinthians. For example, in the Corinthian correspondence, had they never had a problem with communion, we almost certainly would have never heard of anything about Jesus' view of communion. But yet the earliest reference to communion comes from 1 Corinthians. Well, the only reason he mentions it at all is because they were abusing the rite. They were abusing the ritual. So Paul writes his letters to address particular issues. There's a whole host of things he knew he didn't talk about, and he'll even tell them, like I told you, in 1 Corinthians 5:9, he wrote a first letter to the real 1 Corinthians. We don't know what he said. He'll say things to these churches. He'll say, like I instructed you the first time around, you know my view on this. We don't know what his view was because he doesn't say it. And not in that letter he doesn't. So that's the second thing I'd say is, I do not find it at all compelling because he doesn't mention it, therefore he did not know about it. Because that would assume Paul wrote about every single thing he knew. And that's an absolute unjustified assumption. You would have to demonstrate that Paul was trying to write a systematic theology or a systematic chronological history. And that's not at all what Paul ever attempts to write. Even Romans is not a systematic theology. Romans is not. The third thing I would say is there's this basic assumption that the earliest records are from Paul, and since he doesn't write it, it only comes from later in Matthew and Luke, therefore it was made up by then. That's also a false assumption. You would need to demonstrate that because Matthew and Luke come later, therefore it's make-believe. There's no reason to assume that. You need an argument for it. So just because Matthew and Luke come after Paul and Paul doesn't mention it, it does not mean it's false. Almost everything we have in the Gospels, the teachings of Jesus, like 98% of it, come after Paul's letters, but no New Testament scholar thinks 98% of the teaching of Jesus or things about Jesus are make-believe because Paul doesn't mention it. Paul doesn't mention that Jesus went and prayed early in the morning. Does this author think that didn't happen? But Paul should have mentioned that. He should have mentioned that Jesus went and prayed early in the morning. Well, why would that be make-believe? Why would they make that up early in the morning? Why would they make up a whole host of things? So just because it comes later, therefore it can't be trusted, is a profoundly unconvincing argument, and that goes against centuries of New Testament scholarship. What you need to determine is whether or not the oral tradition in the Gospels are early, and there are various ways they do that. But even then, it depends on if that convinces you or not. The fact is, it does appear in Matthew and it does appear in Luke, and they're not the same. They're different. Matthew tells it from the perspective of Joseph, Luke tells it from the perspective of Mary, and they're profoundly similar on the key points, but different in the details. What is overwhelmingly obvious if you take the general New Testament assumption that there's some degree of a traditioning process, that the oral traditions took place in a community, that what Matthew's tradition takes place is from the tradition of Matthew, that oral tradition is passed down from that oral tradition from Joseph, where Luke comes clearly from more of a side of Mary's tradition. And that's exactly why they get different perspectives. It is striking how much they do that. And anyway, that's a long story, but all that to say, the apostles of Jesus don't seem to be aware. That's exactly right. I'll make a further point. Now, if you really want, this is what I thought he was going to say, but he doesn't. I'll help him out here. In Matthew and Luke, the texts which speak of a virgin birth, they never talk about it or assume it again. At no point in Matthew or Luke's Gospels do the apostles or even Mary refer back to a virgin birth. Well, my response is, so what? There's a whole host of things they don't refer back to. But there is no other evidence. There's no other story. And even if there were in Matthew and Luke, even if there were, skeptics would write it off and say, so what? That's Matthew's view. He just wrote it in. If Mary gave a long disquisition about how it all came down, how it all went down, and the angel showed up and he looked like this and this happened, and Joseph almost divorced me. If that happened in Matthew or Luke, skeptics would say that's all make-believe. That came up later on. And if it showed up early in the narrative of the gospel, they would say, you could make up reason why that was make-believe, no matter when it happens. So it's interesting that in the gospels, after those early narratives, it's never alluded to or implied ever again. That's right, it's not. There's a lot of things we don't know about the early life of Jesus, and they're not talked about ever again. And that's what happened in ancient biographies very often. So, nevertheless, I don't find it compelling. This is a shocker that the apostles don't know about it. Let me do a number 2 real quickly. The second thing he mentions, I'll just read it. Number 2, he said, Jesus said he wanted to offer nothing to Gentiles. He says, the fact that Christianity has become a religion largely of Gentiles who literally worship Jesus is a huge irony, because in his ministry, Jesus said he intended to offer Gentiles nothing. And Matthew 10:5 shows Jesus giving his disciples firm instructions to go nowhere among the Gentiles. He says it's true that in chapter 8 of Matthew and chapter 7 of Luke show Jesus healing the servant of a Roman soldier. However, this happened only after the soldier said he was unworthy of Jesus' attention. And then he goes on, it's also possible that Jesus assumed the servant was a Jew, because in Matthew 15:21 and 28, when a woman who was indisputably a Gentile asked for healing for her daughter, Jesus initially ignored her. And then he goes on for a long time. He says, he told her he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then he talks about that Gentiles are no better than a dog and so forth. He goes on and says, further evidence that Jesus had a harsh attitude toward Gentile Gentiles comes from the fact that after his death, resistance from his disciples caused Paul problems in his Gentile conversion efforts. He quotes, see Galatians 2:11-14. Christianity eventually became a religion of Gentiles, not because of any personal outreach to them by Jesus during his lifetime, but because of the work of Paul and the fact that most Jews whom Jesus was really reaching out to rejected it. End quote. Now, this is a huge subject, and there's an enormous amount of literature written on this. To that I would say is, well, I'm a pastor, and that's true. Read your Bible. Jesus does not have a ministry toward Gentiles. He, at best, seems almost neutral. He is kind to them, but he does not reach out to them. He very much seems to have believed that his primary mission was to the Jews. He says that. He's called the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He thinks he's causing a brand new Israel. His 12 apostles, like the 12 tribes of Israel. He's creating a new Israel to the Jews. Secondly, it's false to assume that because he doesn't directly have a ministry to Gentiles, it means he never wants nothing to do with them. If you take Matthew 28 to be authentic to the historical Jesus, and you might not, because some people don't, when Jesus deliberately says to go into the nations, to the Gentiles, preaching and making disciples and so forth, well, he deliberately says it there. If you deny that, that's fine. Then Jesus' ministry, his earthly ministry, was chiefly to Jews. That's true. No one has a problem with that. But it does not follow that he thinks Gentiles have nothing to learn from his ministry, or he would have nothing to do with them. But in fact, he does have something to do with them. He just primarily works with Jews. Now, this issue about being a dog. In Mark chapter 7, and of course in a parallel as well, he quotes from Matthew, but in Mark chapter 7, there's a Greek woman who's a Syrophoenician, and she asks for Jesus to cast a demon out of the daughter. Now, what we find oftentimes is that Jesus assumes Gentiles don't want to have anything to do with Judaism at all. They're not looking for God, who we call God the Father. They're not interested at all in obeying the commandments and wanting to repent of their sins. They do have no interest. So he assumes they don't have faith. That's why it's so striking to Jesus when he finds a Gentile nearby that actually has faith, and they're praised for that. And in Mark's gospel particularly, the Gentiles tend to have more faith than the Jews. In Mark chapter 7, this Syrophoenician woman is one such example. She comes and says, will you cast out a demon of the daughter? In verse 27, Mark 7:27, he said to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. She answered, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. He said, because you've said this, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. It's the only reference in the Gospels where Jesus, having never seen or met or anything, an afflicted person from a distance, gets healed. And it's because this Gentile, in fact, verse 30, she goes back home, the child lying on the bed, and the demon's gone. Well, this issue of dogs is a controversial concept. The word dog there, almost certainly this konarion, means dog, but it very well is probably referring not to a wild scavenging dog, but a small dog you take in as a pet. What Jesus, of course, is giving a metaphor, an image that you don't give to the pets the good food. You give it to those who are supposed to get it first. Of course, the metaphor he's making is, almost like an allegory, is the Jews are supposed to get the food first. That's the Jews are. And she says, right, but even the dogs get the children's crumbs. That is, even the dogs even the dogs can benefit from what is given to the children. Even the dogs can benefit what is supposed to be given to the children. In the same way, she's saying, I can benefit as a Gentile what you're chiefly giving, the food you're giving to the Jews. That's all that means. So there's an order, there's a sequence here. What the problem is the word dog in Judaism sometimes was used as a reference to Gentiles in a derogatory sense. And it seems to be the case because the word, the dog, when used as a scavenger, is a slam on the Gentiles because they eat what is considered unclean food. They eat unclean food. Dogs will eat whatever they can find on the ground. So when the Jews would call Gentiles dog, it's a way of slamming them because they'll eat whatever they're going to eat because it's about impurity. They don't care. Well, Jews do care about eating pure food, according to the Levitical, called kashrut, Levitical laws of the Jewish food. So dogs, don't worry about that. Dogs will eat bacon. They'll eat ham. They'll eat whatever. Jews would never do that. So that's what makes this some people so controversial, is Jesus might, by allegory, by analogy, is referencing this woman to be a dog like that. And that sure is not a nice thing to say. To me, it doesn't seem like a hateful thing to say when the assumption is she does, in fact, eat impure food because she's she's Syrophoenician. But even that, I just don't see that big of a deal, because the point is, the food you give to the children is not meant to be given to the dogs. And that's his ministry. His ministry chiefly is meant for the Jews, not for the Gentiles, even though they can, quote unquote, get the crumbs. And so all that to say, in that example, that is one of Jesus' points. That's right. He has chiefly come for the Jews. And the earliest Jewish Christians understood that. The earliest Jewish Christians, however, understood the implications. They came to grips with the implications of Jesus' death for the forgiveness of sins. It became a really, really big deal. It's why the earliest Jewish Christians started preaching to the Gentiles. And the verses he gives to support otherwise, he's misunderstood the verses and the context. When he says that, I'll go back to requote his blog, when he says, quote, further evidence that Jesus had a harsh attitude toward Gentiles comes from the fact that after his death, resistance from his disciples caused Paul problems in his Gentile conversion efforts. And he quotes Galatians 2:11-14. Those verses do nothing of the sort. First off, there are no verses to demonstrate that Jesus had a, quote, harsh attitude toward Gentiles. There's nothing in the New Testament, there is no evidence that Jesus had a harsh attitude. Secondly, the texts he gives don't work at all. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul is addressing a very particular thing. There are people who believe that let me back up. There are Jewish Christians, these are Jews who believe Jesus was the Messiah, that when they preach to Gentiles, believe that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised before they could become a disciple of Jesus. They believe that because that's what Jews did to Gentiles to come into Judaism before Jesus. That was standard practice. They got baptized, they got circumcised. Say it one more time, there were Jewish Christians that when they're preaching to the Gentiles, they believe those Gentiles need to get circumcised. And that was at battle. That was the issue in Galatians 2:11-14. What happened was Peter was chilling and eating with these Gentiles. That's a big deal for Jews to eat with Gentiles. They were eating with them. But then certain group of people came who followed James, who was one of the leaders of the Jerusalem people, and then he changed tables. He's eating like at a picnic, and when he sees these pro-circumcision people, he changes sides. And that's because the Gentiles were not circumcised. Now, that's a long New Testament debated issue. But that has nothing to do with whether or not Jesus had a harsh attitude to Gentiles. The reason why first off, it's irrelevant. That's not the context at all. It's not because Paul's not mad at Peter changing sides because you shouldn't be talking with the Gentiles. He's upset because these certain Gentiles have not been circumcised. But these are believers. These are Gentile Christians that they have converted. Jesus converts, I know that. But these Jews had preached to Gentiles. The issue is not whether or not they should preach to Gentiles. The issue is, what do you require of a Gentile in order to be a Christian? But they've preached the gospel. The book of Acts repeatedly demonstrates how they preach the gospel to Gentiles. So even in Galatians, the point is not whether or not they should preach Jesus to Gentiles. It's what do you require of a Gentile? So my point is, the earliest Jewish Christians most certainly believed that the gospel was for Gentiles. Once the death and resurrection of Jesus have occurred, and they looked fully at the implications of the death and resurrection of Jesus, moreover, if you believe that Jesus commanded them to go into all the nations, then that's exactly what they did. Furthermore, if you take Acts 15 as historical, and Acts 15:1, this is one of the most well-known passages amongst scholars. It's very important in the history of Christianity. You need to read Acts 15 if you haven't in your life. It's a big, big deal. In Acts 15:1, we have something that exactly what was going on in Galatians. In Acts 15:1, now some men came down from Judea and began to teach the brothers, that's Christian brothers, these are probably Gentile Christian brothers, unless you were circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So these are Jewish Christians going to Gentile Christians to preach the gospel, but they're saying the gospel's true, but you got to be circumcised. In verse 2, Paul and Barnabas had a major argument and debate with them. So them and some other people go, the apostles, the elders, down to Jerusalem to have this settled. And that what they're trying to get settled is, do Gentiles need to be circumcised to be a Christian? Now, in verse 5, but some of the religious party of the Pharisees who had believed stood up and said, now this, a lot of people don't miss this. These are former Pharisees, and now they are Pharisees. They're from the religious party of the Pharisees, and they're Christian. They're Christian Pharisees. You don't hear that preached much these days or studied much. Anyway, the Pharisees say it's necessary to circumcise the Gentiles in order to have them observe the law of Moses. So the Pharisee Christians did believe you have to be circumcised. Listen, verse 6, the apostles and the elders met together to deliberate about this matter. Now, pay close attention, verse 7. And there had been much debate. Peter stood up and said to them, this is Peter, the Peter, Mr. Jewish Christian, who went with, probably to some degree, Jesus, a second-hand man. He stood up and said to them, quote, brothers, you know that some time ago God chose me to preach to the Gentiles, so they would hear the message of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, has testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit just as he did to us. And he made no distinction between them and us, cleansing their hearts by faith. And he goes on some other stuff. Now, this exactly is in counter to what this blogger is saying. What I'm saying is the earliest evidence suggests that the earliest Jewish Christians believed now God wanted them to preach to the Gentiles. It in no way demonstrates that Jesus would never recognize his religion because the Gentiles had preached, that the Jews had preached to the Gentiles. Let me say it this way. Just because Jesus' earthly ministry was primarily geared toward the Jews, it does not follow that his earliest Jewish disciples after his resurrection were wrong to do so. They believed that they were commanded by him to do so. They believed they were commanded by God himself to go preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So it does not follow because Jesus didn't do it, therefore the early church should not have done it. If you need to make that argument, you need to make the argument. And you can't quote Galatians 2 because it has nothing to do with preaching toward Gentiles. It does not show Jesus' harsh attitude of the Gentiles. It only has to do with their working out whether or not Gentile Christians have to be circumcised before they become a Christian. Now, I'm going to pause there and come back for another podcast. Next time, we're going to take on the next one, which is Jesus tells everyone not to think of him as God in the first 3 Gospels. We'll come back next time. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. And also look at my Twitter feed at Glimpse the King or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways reached out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.